Imagine you've just been dragged through the castle gates. Your crime doesn't matter anymore, nothing matters anymore, except the grinding sound of the massive iron door closing behind you as you're thrust into absolute darkness. The first thing that hits you isn't the sight, because there is none. It's the smell of decay, human waste, rotting flesh, and something else, something indescribably worse that makes your stomach revolt instantly. Welcome to a medieval dungeon, where the phrase mercy killing wasn't just an expression. It was a desperate prayer that prisoners whispered into the suffocating darkness, begging for death to rescue them from torments that would make the most creative horror writer weep with inadequacy. If you think modern prisons are harsh, prepare to discover why medieval dungeons were specifically designed not to punish crime, but to break the human spirit so completely that death became not just welcome, but the only rational desire left in minds that had been systematically destroyed by months or years of calculated suffering. Because medieval dungeons weren't correctional facilities, they were laboratories of human misery, where every architectural detail, every administrative policy, and every daily routine was crafted to transform living human beings into begging, broken animals who would confess to anything, betray anyone, and abandon every principle they once held dear. And if this glimpse into the darkest corners of medieval justice is already gripping you as tightly as it gripped me when I first uncovered these buried horrors, consider hitting that subscribe button, because we have many more historical nightmares that will fundamentally change how you view human civilization. Let's start with the physical reality of these underground hells, because the architecture of medieval dungeons was itself a weapon designed to slowly murder the human spirit. These weren't simple jail cells as we might imagine them. They were subterranean caverns carved directly into bedrock, often built below the water table so that they remained perpetually flooded with several inches of stagnant, putrid water that never drained and never dried. The walls wept constantly with moisture that carried minerals, mold, and bacteria that created a toxic slime covering every surface. This wasn't just dampness. It was a living ecosystem of decomposition that ate away at anything organic it touched, including human skin, clothes, and eventually bones. Prisoners who survived long enough would watch their own bodies literally dissolve as the acidic moisture corroded their flesh like a slow-acting chemical weapon. The ceilings were deliberately built so low that standing upright was impossible. Most dungeon cells had ceiling heights of 4 to 5 feet, forcing prisoners to live in permanent crouches that eventually deformed their spines and legs into twisted, arthritic knots of agony. After months in these positions, many prisoners became physically incapable of standing even when briefly released. Their bodies permanently bent into the shape of their captivity. But the most diabolical aspect of dungeon architecture was the complete absence of light. These weren't cells with small windows or even tiny openings to the outside world. They were sealed tombs where prisoners lived in absolute, total darkness 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, for months or years at a time. The human mind, deprived of visual stimulation for extended periods, begins to hallucinate, then disintegrate, creating internal worlds of terror that were often worse than the external reality of imprisonment. The isolation was so complete that many prisoners forgot how to speak, forgot their own names, and eventually forgot that a world existed beyond the walls of their tomb. They became living ghosts, neither fully alive nor mercifully dead, existing in a liminal state that transformed them into creatures that barely resembled the human beings they had once been. Now let's discuss the feeding arrangements, which were less about sustenance and more about prolonging agony for maximum psychological impact. Medieval dungeon prisoners weren't fed to keep them healthy or even alive in any meaningful sense. They were fed just enough to prevent immediate death, creating a state of perpetual starvation that kept them weak, compliant, and mentally fragmented. The typical prison meal consisted of bread so moldy and hard that it had to be soaked in whatever liquid was available, usually the contaminated water that pooled on the dungeon floor. This bread was often made from sawdust, ground bones, and whatever grain scraps were too rotten for animal feed. Eating it was like consuming edible concrete mixed with organic poison, providing just enough calories to prevent death while slowly destroying the digestive system. Water was provided irregularly and was usually contaminated with human waste, dead insects, and bacterial colonies that caused violent dysentery. Prisoners learned to ration this toxic liquid carefully, knowing that drinking too much would cause explosive diarrhea that would leave them dehydrated and lying in their own waste, while drinking too little would cause kidney failure and excruciating pain. Meat, when provided at all, was usually rotten flesh crawling with maggots that had been rejected even for pig feed. Prisoners ate this putrid protein because the alternative was death by starvation, but consuming it often led to food poisoning so severe that many wished they had chosen starvation instead. The maggots, ironically, were often the most nutritious part of these meals, providing protein that kept prisoners alive just long enough to experience more suffering. The feeding schedule was deliberately irregular to prevent prisoners from developing any sense of routine or time passage. Meals might come twice in one day, then not again for 3 days, then sporadically for weeks, creating a psychological torture that made prisoners obsess over food with the desperation of starving animals. And speaking of psychological torture, if you're finding these historical revelations as disturbing and fascinating as we do, a quick subscribe would help us continue excavating these buried truths that reveal the darkest chapters of human behavior. But food was just the beginning of the horrors that awaited dungeon prisoners. The sanitation situation was so nightmarish that it defied description, while somehow managing to get worse every single day. Medieval dungeons had no toilets, no waste removal, and no cleaning protocols. Prisoners were forced to relieve themselves where they sat, slept, and ate, creating an ever-growing pile of human waste that became their permanent companion. This waste didn't just sit there passively. It became a living, breathing ecosystem of bacteria, parasites, and diseases that attacked prisoners from every angle. The ammonia from decomposing urine burned their lungs and eyes, while the bacteria from feces infected every cut, scrape, and sore on their bodies. Many prisoners developed infections so severe that their flesh literally rotted off their bones while they were still alive. The rats that infested these dungeons were nothing like the small creatures we might imagine. These were massive, aggressive rodents that had fed on human waste and corpses for generations, growing to the size of small cats and showing no fear of living humans. They would attack sleeping prisoners, gnawing on toes, fingers, and any exposed flesh, while their victims were too weak to fight back effectively. These rats carried diseases that made plague seem like a minor inconvenience. Prisoners who survived rat attacks often developed infections that caused their limbs to swell, turn black, and eventually fall off. The rats seemed to sense weakness and would focus their attacks on prisoners who were closest to death, accelerating their demise while providing horrifying entertainment for those who were forced to watch. But perhaps the most psychologically devastating aspect of dungeon sanitation was the way it destroyed human dignity so completely that prisoners often lost their sanity before their bodies failed. Living in your own waste, unable to clean yourself, constantly attacked by vermin, many prisoners developed a form of learned helplessness so profound that they stopped trying to survive and simply waited for death while their minds retreated into fantasy worlds that provided the only escape from their unbearable reality. The torture methods employed in medieval dungeons went far beyond the rack and thumbscrews that most people associate with medieval punishment. The most effective tortures were subtle, prolonged, and designed to destroy the prisoner's mind rather than simply cause physical pain. Sleep deprivation was a favorite technique, achieved by keeping prisoners in stress positions that made rest impossible, or by subjecting them to constant noise, temperature changes, or other stimuli that prevented restorative sleep. Prisoners who were deprived of sleep for weeks or months developed hallucinations so vivid that they couldn't distinguish between reality and nightmare. They would confess to crimes they never committed, betray friends and family members, and agree to anything their captors demanded just for the promise of a few hours of uninterrupted rest that often never came. Temperature torture was another favorite, achieved by alternating between extreme heat and cold in ways that prevented the body from adapting to either condition. Prisoners might be kept in rooms heated by braziers until they were on the verge of heat stroke, then suddenly moved to ice-cold chambers where they nearly froze to death, then moved back to heat before their bodies could recover. This cycle would continue for days or weeks until their cardiovascular systems simply gave out. Water torture took many forms, but the most psychologically devastating was the slow drip method, where prisoners were strapped down while water dripped constantly onto the same spot on their forehead. This sounds harmless, but after hours of constant dripping, the sensation becomes unbearable. and after days it drives prisoners completely insane. The anticipation of each drop becomes more tortuous than actual physical pain, creating a form of mental anguish that broken prisoners described as worse than being burned alive. But the real masterpiece of medieval dungeon torture was something called the Little Ease, a cell so small that prisoners couldn't lie down, stand up, or sit comfortably. They were forced to remain in a crouched position that put constant pressure on their joints and muscles, creating agony that intensified every minute of every day. After weeks in the Little Ease, prisoners' bones would begin to deform, their muscles would atrophy, and their minds would snap under the constant physical pressure. The interrogation techniques used in medieval dungeons were designed not to extract truth, but to extract confessions, regardless of guilt or innocence. Prisoners were told that their suffering would end only when they confessed to whatever crimes their captors specified, but the reality was that confession often led to execution, while maintaining innocence led to prolonged torture that could last for years. The interrogators were skilled psychologists who understood exactly how to break human resistance. They would alternate between extreme brutality and false kindness, offering prisoners hope and then snatching it away, creating emotional whiplash that was more effective than any physical torture at destroying mental stability. Many prisoners developed Stockholm Syndrome, becoming emotionally attached to their captors and eventually believing that they deserved their punishment. These broken individuals would sometimes confess to crimes they knew they hadn't committed, simply because they had been convinced that they were inherently evil and worthy of suffering. The social dynamics within dungeons created additional layers of horror that turned prisoners against each other in fights for survival that stripped away every vestige of human decency. Food was so scarce that prisoners would steal from each other, fight over scraps, and sometimes resort to cannibalism when fellow prisoners died. The strong preyed on the weak, creating hierarchies of abuse that mirrored the cruelty of their captors. Information became currency in this underground economy of desperation. Prisoners would betray each other's secrets, real or fabricated, in exchange for better treatment, extra food, or simply the sadistic pleasure of watching someone else suffer. These betrayals often targeted the most vulnerable prisoners, including children, elderly individuals, and those who were already broken by their imprisonment. Sexual violence was endemic in medieval dungeons, perpetrated not just by guards, but by fellow prisoners who had been dehumanized to the point where they saw rape as simply another survival strategy. Women prisoners faced additional horrors that were specifically designed to destroy their sense of self-worth and reduce them to objects of entertainment for their captors. Children in medieval dungeons suffered fates that were so horrific that many historical accounts refuse to describe them in detail. These young prisoners, often imprisoned for minor thefts or simply being in the wrong place at the wrong time, were subjected to abuses that destroyed their development and turned them into feral creatures who bore little resemblance to normal human children. The medical care available to dungeon prisoners was not designed to heal, but to keep prisoners alive long enough to extract maximum suffering from their punishment. Prison physicians were often sadists who used their medical knowledge to prolong agony rather than relieve it. They would treat infections just enough to prevent death, set broken bones incorrectly so they would heal in painful positions, and perform procedures without anesthesia as additional forms of torture. These medical practitioners developed expertise in keeping human beings alive in conditions that should have killed them quickly. They knew exactly how much blood a person could lose without dying, how long someone could survive without food, and what injuries would cause maximum pain while still allowing the victim to remain conscious and aware of their suffering. Some prison physicians conducted medical experiments on prisoners that would later inspire the worst atrocities of modern warfare. They would test poisons, perform unnecessary surgeries, and deliberately infect prisoners with diseases to study their progression. These experiments were justified as advancing medical knowledge, but the reality was that they satisfied the sadistic curiosities of individuals who had been given unlimited power over helpless victims. But here's an important historical reality check that provides some perspective on these horrors. Not all medieval prisoners experienced these extreme conditions, and not all dungeons were designed as death camps. Some facilities held prisoners for ransom, political leverage, or other purposes that required keeping them relatively healthy and sane. Wealthy prisoners or those with powerful connections might be held in tower rooms rather than underground dungeons, provided with better food, allowed visitors, and given some basic comforts that made their imprisonment bearable if not pleasant. These privileged prisoners often had servants, could receive books and writing materials, and were treated more like house guests than torture victims. However, even these relatively comfortable prisoners lived with the constant knowledge that their treatment could change instantly based on political developments, changes in their captors' moods, or shifts in their families' abilities to pay ransom. The threat of being transferred to the real dungeons was often used as psychological torture that was almost as effective as actual physical abuse. Political prisoners sometimes received special treatment that was designed more to humiliate than to cause physical suffering. They might be paraded through streets, forced to confess publicly to crimes against the state, or subjected to elaborate public tortures that served as entertainment and political propaganda rather than simple punishment. The duration of imprisonment varied wildly, depending on the prisoner's crime, social status, and the political climate of their region. Some prisoners were held for weeks or months pending trial or ransom negotiations, while others were effectively sentenced to death by slow torture that could take years to complete. The uncertainty of their situation was itself a form of psychological torture that prevented prisoners from developing coping mechanisms or maintaining hope for eventual release. Record-keeping in medieval dungeons was minimal and often deliberately obscured to prevent accountability for the atrocities committed within their walls. Many prisoners simply disappeared into these facilities and were never seen again, with no official record of their fate and no investigation into their treatment. This bureaucratic invisibility made it possible for guards and administrators to commit unlimited atrocities without fear of consequences. The guards who worked in medieval dungeons were often recruited from the most violent and unstable elements of society. These positions attracted individuals who enjoyed inflicting suffering and who saw their jobs as opportunities to exercise unlimited power over helpless victims. The isolation of dungeon work also attracted people who wanted to escape accountability for their actions in the outside world. These guards developed cultures of cruelty that were passed down through generations of prison workers. New guards were often initiated through participation in particularly brutal acts against prisoners, creating bonds of shared guilt that ensured silence about the atrocities they witnessed and committed. The psychological impact on guards was also significant, though rarely acknowledged in historical records. Many developed what we would now recognize as symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder, becoming alcoholics, developing sleep disorders, and often becoming violent in their personal lives. The work of dehumanizing others inevitably dehumanized the perpetrators as well, creating cycles of abuse that extended far beyond the dungeon walls. The economic aspects of medieval dungeons reveal another layer of horror in their operation. These facilities were often profit-making enterprises, where every aspect of prisoner treatment was calculated to maximize revenue while minimizing costs. Prisoners' families were charged for their loved ones' food, water, and even the privilege of visiting them in their cells. The most profitable prisoners were those who could be kept alive for extended periods while their families paid ongoing fees for their maintenance. This created perverse incentives where guards had financial motivations to keep prisoners in states of prolonged suffering rather than allowing them the mercy of quick deaths. Wealthy prisoners might be able to purchase better treatment, cleaner cells, more food, or even temporary releases, creating a two-tier system where suffering was distributed according to ability to pay. Poor prisoners, who had no one to advocate for them or pay for improvements in their conditions, experienced the full horror of dungeon life without any hope of relief. The religious aspects of medieval dungeons added another dimension of psychological torture that specifically targeted prisoners' spiritual beliefs and sense of meaning. Many dungeons were built beneath religious institutions, and prisoners could often hear church services, prayers, and hymns from above while they suffered in darkness below. This constant reminder of divine mercy that was being denied to them was designed to break their spiritual as well as physical resistance. Chaplains who visited dungeons often preached that prisoners' suffering was divine punishment for their sins, and that their agony was preparation for the eternal torments that awaited them in hell. Rather than providing comfort, these religious visits were designed to convince prisoners that their suffering was justified. and that resistance was not just futile, but sinful. Some prisoners found strength in their religious beliefs and were able to maintain their sanity and dignity through prayer and faith. However, many others experienced spiritual crises that shattered their belief systems and left them psychologically adrift in ways that were often more devastating than physical torture. The seasonal variations in dungeon conditions created additional layers of suffering that changed with the weather and calendar. Winter brought freezing temperatures that turned the ever-present dampness into ice that formed on walls and floors, while prisoners had no protection beyond whatever rags they wore when imprisoned. Summer brought heat that turned dungeons into suffocating ovens, where the stench of waste and decay became so overwhelming that even guards avoided entering cells, except when absolutely necessary. The heat also accelerated the decomposition of organic matter, creating toxic gases that poisoned the air and made breathing painful. Spring floods often filled dungeons with contaminated water that rose to chest level, forcing prisoners to stand or drown, while sewage and debris swirled around them for days or weeks. Many prisoners who survived years of imprisonment finally succumbed during these floods, too weak to keep their heads above water for the duration of the flooding. So there you have it, the complete unvarnished truth about medieval dungeons exposed in all its soul-crushing horror, places where human creativity was channeled into developing new methods of prolonging suffering, where death wasn't the worst thing that could happen to you, and where the mercy of a quick execution was a luxury reserved for the fortunate few who committed crimes serious enough to warrant immediate killing. These dungeons represented humanity at its absolute worst, creating systems of institutionalized cruelty that transformed both victims and perpetrators into creatures that bore little resemblance to the human beings they had once been. They were laboratories where the limits of human endurance were tested, not for scientific knowledge, but for the sadistic entertainment of those who held absolute power over life, death, and everything in between. The legacy of medieval dungeons reminds us that human beings are capable of infinite cruelty when given unlimited power over others, and when that power is exercised without accountability or oversight. These facilities existed not because they were necessary for public safety, but because they satisfied fundamental human desires for revenge, dominance, and the infliction of suffering on those who were perceived as different, dangerous, or simply inconvenient. The next time you complain about the conditions in modern prisons or the harshness of contemporary justice systems, remember these medieval dungeon prisoners who would have considered solitary confinement in a clean, heated cell with regular meals and medical care to be an impossible paradise. Because in medieval dungeons, the greatest mercy wasn't rehabilitation, redemption, or even justice. It was the simple, final mercy of death that ended suffering, that had no purpose beyond satisfying humanity's capacity for evil. And since you've made it through this journey into the absolute depths of human cruelty, I'd love to know where in the world you're watching from. Drop your country or city in the comments below, because it amazes us that these dark chapters of our shared human history reach people everywhere, serving as reminders of how far we've come and how vigilant we must remain to prevent sliding backward into these depths of institutionalized horror. Now, if you'll excuse me, I'm going to appreciate the fact that I live in an era where human rights exist, even if imperfectly, and where death is no longer considered the merciful option for those who run afoul of authority.